Good morning, everyone. Welcome to New Perspectives in Social Development, held by Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center, Fountain Inn, USA, in Surat, India, in collaboration with Auro University. We're happy to have with us today Jared Quek, who is the member of Sri Aurobindo Society Singapore branch, and who has been practicing integral yoga in conjunction with his Christian faith for 20 years. He holds 2 postgraduate degrees from the University of Oxford, specializing in Indian philosophy, Christian theology, and business administration. He works in the educational sector and invests in technology companies. I wanted to mention that his thesis was on integral monism, comparative study of Kashmiri Shaivism and Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy. So today, Jared will focus on the stage of mental subjectivism as described by Sri Aurobindo in the Human Cycle, sharing some thoughts on the myth of Atlantis and its cardinal importance to the coming age of the mental subjectivism, briefly contrasting this vision of the future with the offered by Western transhumanists who believe in using human augmentation technologies to alter society and destiny. It's a very provoking thought subject. So I welcome Jared. So Jared, please address the audience. So we will have 40 minutes, 45 of his presentation, and then we will have questions and answer sessions at the end. So please post your questions into questions and answers box. Thank you.
Thank
Please,
you,
Jared.
Vladimir. Okay, so good morning or good evening, everyone. There's a bit of echo, Vladimir.
I don't hear echo.
Okay.
I heard a little bit, but speak a little bit more, Jared, and we'll see.
Okay, so so you can hear me clearly, right, Vladimir and Rade?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the screen, the slides are being shown, just to confirm. Yes?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so again, good evening or good morning, everyone. So this is actually the part 2 of what we were discussing the other time, mental subjectivism. And I'll do a very brief recap of part 1 before we move on to part 2, which might be actually the more provocative of the 2 parts, actually. So, I mean, the conventional view of the future, as discussed last time, is one dominated by technology of AI, of genetic engineering, of starships, and so on and so forth. But Sri Aurobindo, if you study the works of Sri Aurobindo, I think what we need to really imagine or envisage is not a linear progression, but really an extraordinary bending of the curve that will take us to what he calls the spiritual age of humanity. One of the great differences of Sri Aurobindo with many other spiritual thinkers is that he envisaged not an individual transformation of humanity, not say just individuals being transformed, but the whole collective society of humanity, communities of humans being transformed. And that is really something very unique. And in this spiritual age of humanity, where the spirit takes the forefront in society as a whole, this is where the knowledge of the spirit as ultimate reality takes center stage. As he writes that a society which was even initially spiritualized will make the revealing and finding of the divine self in man the supreme, even the guiding aim of all its activities, its education, its knowledge, its science, its ethics, its art, its economical and political structure. So it is not merely, or should we say, it does not stop an individual transformation, but a social transformation, the transformation of education, knowledge, science, ethics, art, and so on. And this is what characterizes the spiritual age. And Sri Aurobindo not just believes, but his whole work is oriented to take us there. for those who have been who have studied Sri Aurobindo or his disciples, we know about the descent of the supermind, which is his main work, so to speak. And the supermind is meant to facilitate this coming of the spiritual age. So this is something already very extraordinary. And it is explored in this comparatively, should we say, and beyond that, not only does he envisage this, he actually provides a kind of roadmap to it, especially captured in this extraordinary book that he has written called The Human Cycle. And I will refer you actually to chapter 23, where he actually sets out very clear, should we say, testable landmarks that we can sort of gauge almost the progress we are making towards the spiritual age. So this book, Human Cycle, I mean, even in Sri Aurobindo circles, among people who study his works, I would dare to say it is comparatively neglected, actually, compared to, say, the Life Divine, Savitri, Synthesis of Yoga, and so on. The Human Cycle is not, let's just say, the one work that is studied by a lot of the scholars or followers of himself. And frankly, I feel that a lot more attention should be given to it because it is a truly extraordinary work. It is one of the very few works in spiritual literature I ever read that really deals with the collective transformation of humanity, the collective. It is something that is really, really original. And beyond that, in say chapter 23, there's actually a very clear roadmap that helps us understand where we are at, society as a whole. And I heard before how Sri Aurobindo especially appeals to certain people of a certain scientific mentality. Maybe this can be exaggerated, but definitely what Sri Aurobindo provides are things that can be tested. He does not provide airy-fairy stuff that, you can take it like it's in any way you can. Actually, he provides very precise indications of many, many things. In this case, he provides precise indications of what kind of things we should look forward to as we move towards this spiritual age. So one of his predictions is that he says that for the spiritual age to come, both society and the individual must be ready. And for society, or what he calls the so-called common mind of man to be ready, he gives another very clear, precise prediction. He said the first essential, that means it must happen, sign, must be the growth of the subjective idea of life, the idea of the soul, the inner being, its powers, possibilities, its growth, its expression, and the creation of a true, beautiful, and helpful environment for it as the one thing of first and last importance. So he's saying that this subjective idea of life must conquer, or at least must spread throughout society first. This is about as precise as you can get. I'm sure you agree. It is not something unclear. He's predicting this extremely, that this must happen. He says it's going to happen in no other way. That's why he has essential and is must in the same statement, right? And beyond that, when he says the word soul, and the word soul here, he nuances it further. He says that at the start, we will not actually reach at one leap the soul as the spirit. That means that when humankind first look within, when such subjective ideas first take off, we are not going to, he makes that clear prediction, we are not going to instantly identify the soul as the spirit. Instead, he says that we will pass from this rationalistic, materialistic focus, which in the last talk we say is how it's actually in the 19th century. He gave very clear signs of that. We will pass first into what he calls vital subjectivism, where we sort of focus on the vital force as the ultimate reality, the vital force as our true self, the vital force as the one thing that generated this whole universe. He's saying quite clearly, we will have to pass through this stage first. And as we discussed in our last part one, he gave clear indications that this vital subjectivism is something that more or less stretches from the late 19th century to about the end of the World War II. So, of course, at the time when he was writing the Arya, where he most likely first wrote this passage in the human cycle, World War II has not happened yet. So he was looking forward to the end of vital subjectivism. Okay, so, but where we are now at is the next stage where he sort of projects. He calls it mental subjectivism, where we identify our soul, our true self, and indeed the very true nature of the universe as the mind, however defined. So as intelligence, however defined. He's saying this era will come after the vital subjectivism. He's looking quite far ahead at that point. And as we discussed in part 1, if we follow what he describes about mental subjectivism, which is quite precise, we can probably say that we are actually deep into this stage already. I'm not going to recap what we discussed the last time about the rise of computational metaphors, the rise of certain philosophies that deals with mind as the generator of the universe, the whole universe as a computer simulation, the rise of the internet and all those science. So as I argued the last time, most likely we are in fact deep into this final stage. And the year 2020, last year, was a hinge year, which actually accelerated many of these phenomena. So of course, from one perspective, it is a very, very good thing because mental subjectivism is the last stage before the spiritual age of humanity. And again, we may not need to be surprised that things have moved so fast in a sense, because if we are followers of Sri Aurobindo and if we have faith in his works and the mother's works, we all know about the descent of the supermind in 1956, which is the culmination of Sri Aurobindo's work. And the one thing, the one change, the one great change in the descent that will take us forward. And we therefore should not be too surprised that the stage of mental subjectivism has in a sense been accelerated, or in fact, the movement through vital to mental subjectivism has in a way been accelerated. In fact, that's exactly what it should be if we believe that the supermind can speed things up, hedonize, he used the interesting word, the life divine, hedonize, that means make more enjoyable the whole process. And we also explored in part 1 how when mental subjectivism, we are likely to be reaching this particular stage of mental subjectivism where, because mental subjectivism itself has multiple stages as we described the last time, we are most likely going to reach what he calls the true stage of mental subjectivism, where on the collective level, within certain communities, we breach the barrier between our surface mentality, our outer mind, our outer life, our outer bodies, and our so-called inner being, the vast mind and life and bodies that lie behind us. Again, this is something he predicts in very precise terms, with no qualifications, so that's why I find chapter 23 of the human cycle a truly extraordinary chapter, because he holds, it is there, for all to see. It is something you can really compare with what's happening around the world with, it's nothing vague there, really. So, and he's saying that this society is, when we breach that barrier, there will be societies where the ideal of the development of one's inner being takes first place, no longer about economic growth or technological growth for its own sake, but where the growth of one's inner being is seen as a chief task of the human being and the chief thing that society needs to facilitate. Needless to say, this must first take place in pioneering communities first, like Auroville and so on, and the ashram and so on, not everywhere, but I mean certain communities, certain nations, and so on and so forth. This much is clear, and this is what we discussed in the last part 1. And my own belief, as I tried to show, is that this is not something that's far off. In fact, it's something that's very likely to happen in the next few decades, actually, if we look at the science that he has analyzed. So this is something from Sri Aurobindo about the rise to true mental subjectivism. But it is conceivable that this tendency to mechanize life, which is the first stage, you can say, of mental subjectivism, may hereafter rise to the higher idea of man as a mental being, a soul in mind that must develop itself individually and collectively in the life and body through the play of an ever-expanding mental existence, through the greatening of its mental and psychic being, our souls, and the discovery bringing forward the organization of its subliminal nature and its forces, the utilization of a larger mind and a larger life waiting for discovery within us. I find these to be very hopeful words, that behind the chaos of this world, which we discussed in part 1, there's something great like this waiting to happen, that in certain communities, this bringing forward of our subliminal nature is going to happen on a collective scale, not on the individual scale merely, which has happened many, many, many times before in the spiritual history of man, but on a collective scale. And he is saying that this must happen before we can attain the spiritual age of humanity. We cannot leap from the physical man in one step to the spiritual age of humanity. It's not going to happen. He makes that very, very clear in chapter 23. He says this stage of mental subjectivism is a must. It must happen first, a necessary step. It might be a quick step because of the supramental descent, a quicker step, but it cannot be a step you can just jump across. So this is something really hopeful, which perhaps in the next few decades, in my view, we are going to see actually in a certain collective, collective scale. And we are not going to read this because in the interest of time, this was already dealt with in part 1. The slides will also be made available. He's basically saying that this age will bring about wonderful things, a new science, which is basically a kind of occultism, which will bring the physical world into a true subjection to our minds and spirit. It will develop a new art and beauty. It will bring about closer interchange between human minds and probably human nations, hopefully, and so on and so forth. So it will be a wonderful thing that we should look forward to. And you can tell even from the short extracts I'm taking, he does not describe this in a vague way. He describes this in a very precise way. He has foreseen this, and we can look forward to it happening. Now, so that brings us to our discussion today. There's quite a lot of material, and I will not be, as Vladimir suggests, I'll not be rushing through it. I'll do what we can. The rest of it, we'll just leave it as in the slides, because this is both an interesting and maybe a rather large topic to be discussed in 45 minutes, especially given the need for a recap. So I'm going now into what Sri Aurobindo and the mother talks about on Atlantis. Basically, what we are trying to do here is Sri Aurobindo's corpus of work is huge, as all of us know, 20 plus volumes and so on and so forth. And the mother's corpus of work, if you include the agenda, is really huge if you put them all together. But when we do try to get all of them, much of it together, sometimes we can see connections that may not be so apparent. And now what I'm trying to do is to draw this connection between mental subjectivism and what Sri Aurobindo mentioned about Atlantis. And we will see that if we draw this connection without even taking a leap into the unknown, which actually I plan to take in part 2, we can arrive at some very, very interesting conclusions. So the first thing, so I will tell, so for the first section of this talk, so to speak, we will be sticking very, very closely simply to a holistic consideration of his works. And I think we can arrive at some very, very interesting conclusions already. The second section, which we may not have much time for, I'm going to take a bit of a leap and discuss some radical notions, but we will stick to the, okay, everything in Sri Aurobindo is radical, right? But I'm going to take a leap of faith, so to speak. So far, what Sri Aurobindo said is that Atlantis is a civilization, he puts it very clearly, that went to the extreme of occult tradition, of occult knowledge. The exact quote is given there. And if what he says is that if Atlantean civilization attained an extremely developed and generalized inner knowledge, then actually it's not the conclusion is in fact inescapable that it must have attained to a degree the stage of mental subjectivism. And of course, that is quite an interesting conclusion really, because Atlantis was supposed to be a really, really, really old civilization, which means that mental subjectivism is not a stage that humanity is in fact attaining for the first time. It's much more likely that humanity is recovering this stage. Perhaps Atlantis was the first and maybe the only civilization, we don't know, to attain it. But what we may almost certainly conclude is that if we put 2 plus 2 together, that Atlantean culture, artifacts, and ideas are actually likely to resurface in the coming age of mental subjectivism. This is the basic thesis. I'm going to go more into his writings to sort of show this. There is this talk which so instead of space colonies and giant robots, we should be expecting an inconceivable eruption of a very much forgotten past into the present and the future. There's this very interesting verse from Savitri, which was quoted by Georges van Wrekum in one of his oral. I mean, a lot of us know him, right? And he gave this talk about Atlantis and Lemuria in about 8 years ago in Auroville. And he was quoting this line here from Savitri, which is an endless spiral of ascent and fall until at last is reached the giant point through which his glory shines for whom we were made, and we break into the infinity of God. Clearly, this verse in the original context most likely referred to the individual, but it's actually also true for the whole of humanity. So human civilizations and humanity as a whole has gone through many ascent, many falls, many ascent, many falls, most of which are forgotten, almost all of which in fact are forgotten. Human history stretched back about at least 100,000 years. I'm not saying civilization is 100,000 years, but I mean, Homo sapiens has existed for about that long. And so when we reach this giant point of the supramental change, right, in which the divine and Aditi and infinity will just break out, when we reach that point, von Van Wrekum makes a very interesting point. Before we can reach this giant point, isn't it quite likely that humanity has sort of explored almost every conceivable way of life, every conceivable way of civilization long before? In a way, we must go through all these stages before we can reach this giant point of spiritual change. Humanity must have its fill almost of its exploration. So given this point, which Van Wrekum makes, it's not at all surprising in a way that Atlantis almost certainly has in fact attained the stage of mental subjectivism before. It is something that has been done before. It's part of the exploration of humanity long before we can reach this giant point, which is now. So to further explore this, I will be looking more closely at what Sri Aurobindo said about Atlantis. He only dropped a few clues, actually, because at the point where he was writing, he probably wasn't, I mean, he has to bring down the supermind first, right? I mean, this is something a bit much further, and maybe somewhat off in the future at that point. So first we look at the connection between what Sri Aurobindo called occultism and Atlantis. So occultism he describes not as some diabolical thing, but as the discovery of the hidden truths and powers of the mind force, the life force, and the greater forces of the concealed spirit. Occult science, he says, is essentially the science of the subliminal in ourselves, the subliminal in world nature, and of all that is in connection with the subliminal, including the subconscious and the superconscious, and the use of it as part of self-knowledge and world knowledge and the right dynamization of that knowledge. So notice the word subliminal, the number of times we repeated it. Occult science is the science of the subliminal. And there is no doubt that in an age of mental subjectivism, where the subliminal takes first place, occult science will naturally also come out. In fact, that's exactly what he predicts. And Sri Aurobindo, in no uncertain terms, link Atlantis with occultism. If you look at this rather old writing of his, 1908, right, rather early, or I think 08 or so, he says that for man intellectually developed, mighty in scientific knowledge and the mastery of gross and subtle nature, using the elements as his servants and the world as his footstool, but undeveloped in heart and spirit, becomes only an inferior kind of asura, using the powers of a demigod to satisfy the nature of an animal. according to dim traditions and memories of the old world, of such a nature was the civilization of old Atlantis, submerged beneath the ocean when its greatness and its wickedness became too great, too heavy a load for the earth to bear, and our own legends of the Asuras represent a similar consciousness of a great but abortive development in humanity. So he said it's a great but abortive. That means it stopped. It did not reach its full fruition. There is no, I mean, it's quite clear from this text that he's associating Atlantis in a way with our current scientific civilization, but it's also clear that Atlantis went well beyond our current scientific civilization because they mastered the subtle elements as well. And then he writes in another place, I will just read this last part because due to interest of time. If the tradition of Atlantis is correct, it is that of a progress which went to the extreme of occult knowledge, but could go no further. In the India of Vedic times, we have the record left of the other line of achievement, that of spiritual self-discovery. Occult knowledge was there, but kept subordinate. So again and again, we hear that if the tradition is correct, and then he also mentioned that this minority, a small minority of humanity has pushed beyond the barriers, opening the doors to occult and spiritual knowledge and preparing the ascent of the evolution beyond mental man into spiritual and supramental being. Sometimes this minority has exercised an enormous influence, as in Vedic India, to the rishis, of course, Egypt, or according to tradition in Atlantis, and determined the civilization of the race, giving a strong stamp for the spiritual or the occult. Now, of course, we say, Sri Aurobindo seems to be unsure here because he keeps on saying, according to tradition, if tradition is correct. But the interesting thing is, in private, he doesn't qualify his statement as anything as much. So we say in the evening talks, right? So this is from the evening talks, which is his private conversations with his disciple, right? So this disciple asked, their theory, probably the Theosophists or whoever they may be, is that there was a great civilization on the continent of Atlantis. Sri Aurobindo answers, yes, there's every possibility that it is true. So I think you can tell that Sri Aurobindo is actually much stronger. He uses much stronger language when he is sort of in his private talks. He adds in the same conversation, there's always some truth at the bottom. For instance, there is every likelihood that the continent of Atlantis had a great civilization. Later on in the conversation, or I believe, or it could be another part earlier, on the vital plane, there is nothing you cannot see. You can recast the whole history of the world. It is not the mental plane. Really speaking, it's the mental vital. I was in that condition for 10 days, and any number of things came at that time. In other words, when Sri Aurobindo qualifies his statement, my own view, and I think that's very, very likely, is actually he's just conceding to the possible skepticism of readers. As someone who has written academic texts myself, to be very honest, I do the same thing myself. Sometimes I'm very sure of a certain conclusion, but because I recognize that the reader might be skeptical, so I will qualify it. But in truth, I don't believe I need any qualification. And so I think something similar might be going on there. So I think we can be quite sure that Sri Aurobindo is giving us quite clear hints of what Atlantis is about. And it is about occultism, it's about inner knowledge. And if that is so, he uses quite strong words. He says it has pushed occult knowledge to the extreme. If that is so, then it has in fact quite clearly attained to a degree of the stage of mental subjectivism. And on top of that, Atlantis was also likely to have lasted a long time, and that's actually not something new. A lot of people say that, include Plato, the Theosophists, and whatever degree of credibility you want to give them. So Sri Aurobindo writes that this mental and psychic subjectivism would have what vital subjectivism has not. It cannot easily have the chance of detecting discernment, strong safeguards, and a powerful liberating light. Based on what Sri Aurobindo says on mental subjectivism, we can probably assume that the safeguards and enlightened guardianship of the elite, so-called elite of Atlantis, allowed the civilization to persist for a pretty long time. It was a very old civilization. On top of that, it persisted for a really long time. And most likely had a pretty deep impact on the rest of humanity, although that cycle of civilization seems to have wiped clean from the memory of man largely, despite certain legends and all. And we also know from all the different traditions, as Sri Aurobindo alluded to, Atlantis clearly did not progress beyond the stage of mental subjectivism. There was no breakthrough to a generalized spirituality. I mean, if they did, we will all be in that civilization, in fact. So we do not know why. Maybe the masses of humanity was unready. Maybe Atlantis was a great but abortive achievement, as what Sri Aurobindo puts it, too far ahead of its time, actually. Like one or two communities just break ahead of the race, but the rest of humanity was far behind. So whatever it was, Atlantis, of course, went under the ocean and it was destroyed. So all the traditions, whether Plato, Theosophy, those modern psychic readings, unanimous that the original land is gone. It's somewhere beneath the ocean, most likely beneath the Atlantic Ocean, although people have placed Atlantis in any number of places, from the Antarctic to the Mediterranean Ocean to the Indian Ocean and everywhere else. But an exact cause of that varies as well. So although everyone agrees that some form of severe corruption, in Plato's original, it was basically the divine nature from Poseidon, the god of the ocean, or Varuna in the Vedic equivalent, had sort of set in. The divine nature was diluted and the Atlanteans became corrupted. They were half divine. They were a half divine race at the beginning, according to Plato, but they lost it gradually. Or if you quote from the Bible, the earth was full of violence and the great flood came. So despite the fall, what we can, if we put 2 + 2 together, I think it's quite clear that society is, if our society is to reattain mental subjectivism, then again, Atlantean culture, artifacts, ideas are likely to resurface. Of course, the word how is that going to happen? It will be open to question. It could be archaeological findings, it could be reincarnated souls, it could be just new ideas that are not new at all. They actually come from the subconscious of man, from the buried layers of the Atlantean age. In fact, a lot of things are probably like that. That a lot of the so-called new ideas we have in the society are actually very old ideas. They were just forgotten, but they start resurfacing. Nature, Prakriti will just bring them up at the right time. I think that's one idea that Sri Aurobindo explores a few times. Okay, so at this point, I think we are still sticking very, very closely to the writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. The Mother does not directly, as far as I know, I did a thorough search of the Mother's existing writings on Atlantis and Yafunen, actually nothing. But why that is so, I have no idea. But what Georges van Bracken wrote in one of his books, he cited some children of the ashram who claims, this is a second-hand account, who claims that the Mother did speak of Atlantis, and she says that the physical and spiritual science, I mean the occult sciences of Atlantis were well ahead of even our current civilization, which is quite an extraordinary thing, given how powerful, in a sense, we are in physical technology, right? But that is not a source I could verify. I have no idea where the Mother mentioned it. But I think that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother are one, right? And based on the writings of Sri Aurobindo, the conclusion so far and the discussion so far, I think is quite well grounded. However, now we shall, in the remaining time of about 10 to 15 minutes, I would like to move on to something a bit more radical. Something that is, I wouldn't say not directly supported, but we are going to, I need to qualify that we are going to move a bit further off from the writings of Sri Aurobindo. Although Vladimir will tell me that nothing can be really taken away from the writings of Sri Aurobindo, because really his vision is so global. Everything is sort of prefigured in seed. And okay, but so what am I actually am of the opinion that, to just put it bluntly, I do not think that Atlantean civilization has actually ceased to exist. I'll put it out there. That's actually what I'm going to argue. I mean, generally, in most of the traditions we talk about, we believe that Atlantis was something of the past. It's gone forever, and so on and so forth. But if we look at it carefully, based on the books of Sri Aurobindo and so on, I actually don't think that is likely. In fact, yeah, I think that Atlantis actually still exists. Now, why do I believe such a weird thing? Well, okay, I think there is a chain of logic I'm trying to demonstrate here. Again, I qualify, this is not, Sri Aurobindo didn't write about this. He did not say that Atlantis still exists or anything of that sort. But let's just consider what's going on. First is that all the existing traditions that I know of indicate that Atlantis, not all the Atlantis died in the cataclysm. They were survivors. In the famous story of the Great Flood in the Bible, there was Noah and his family, right? I mean, that's one story all of us know. And it's true for the rest. Plato may not directly, as far as I know, wrote about survivors, but he wrote Atlantis as a giant empire that stretches well beyond Atlantis. It seems inconceivable no one survived. Now, the second thing is that the survivors will almost certainly include members of what Sri Aurobindo called the occult elite, right? So-called, that guided Atlantis. Again, I need to emphasize the word occult has nothing to do with the diabolical. It just means people who understand the inner worlds, who can tap on the powers of the inner worlds, wizards, if you may, but something like that. If nothing else, most likely these occult elite have foreseen the disaster. Now, the third thing to establish is that occult science is based much less on cumbersome machinery. It's much less, therefore, likely to be lost or reduced in effectiveness, even in a terrible disaster. And whatever machinery is so-called, in fact, that's the very nature. I mean, in India, we talk about the Siddhis and the Siddhas, right? The people who are accomplished, who have mastered occult powers. The thing that Siddhas need, generally speaking, is, well, themselves. They use mantras, they use the power of concentration, they use the power of their vitals. They do not generally require a lot of machinery, although they may make use of certain plants, certain gemstones, or whatever it might be, but these are not huge things. So, in other words, if the knowledge and power of Atlantis largely survived the cataclysm, just because, you know, some of those occult elites survived, rebuilding is actually perfectly possible. I don't see why not. And what is the logic that is not possible? The primary point is that an occult civilization is much more resilient than a purely technological one. Yeah, so a purely technological one. I heard the Force analogy given before. They say that, okay, so Atlantis exploded, right? And the survivors must have degenerated in savagery. But let's just look at this idea closely. The analogy they give is that let's transport, say, 5,000 Americans from New York City into the middle of some very backward developing country. Let's not use any names or anything, it's very insulting. Let's just say 5,000 Americans to some very, 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 very backward country with no technology, no power plants, nothing whatsoever. So they say, what will happen to these Americans? Of course, the Americans will descend into savagery because our physical technology, our internet, our power plants are dependent on a huge amount of machinery. That is true. If our physical civilization blows up, we will descend into barbarism. But let's pause for a moment. Do that need to be true for the Atlanteans? Because as Sri Aurobindo clearly wrote, Atlantis is a civilization that pushed the occult science to the extreme. So if a number of the Siddhas, so to speak, the Atlantean elite, so to speak, let's not say a large number, let's just say 100 of them, survived the disaster, they will actually largely retain their effectiveness and their so-called technology. In fact, their knowledge and power is likely to be pretty much untouched. They may have lost certain things, no doubt, unless but they can certainly rebuild the whole of Atlantis if they wanted to. So the question is, so the only way in which Atlantis can be completely destroyed is the highly and almost impossible scenario where every last Atlantean is killed. And that, to me, is just, it does not adhere to the whatever legends we have of Atlantis, which is why I thought the logic is much stronger to assume that Atlantis actually still exists. So then, of course, the next question is, if the Atlanteans still exist, and if they have largely so-called rebuilt their civilization, then where are they? Shouldn't we see them flying all over the place and sort of being one of the leading country in the world, and so on and so forth, teaching the rest of the world? But the answer to me, at least, is that the Atlanteans have done that before, and their civilization collapsed because they was open to the world. That is a very important point to note. In fact, I feel that if any rebuilding they would do, they would seek to avoid the mistakes of the previous cycle. And if we think that Atlantean civilization have disappeared, it's actually not like necessarily a sign of extinction, but a deliberate concealment. Because all Atlantis represents a nation of gnosis open to the world, an island of light in a sea of unconscious. Here I am actually quoting from Sri Aurobindo. He wrote about that in the context of the overmind consciousness. This openness empowered certain purposes. But when you exchange between civilizations, where you have this nation of light and knowledge exchanging with the rest of the world, which is far, far behind, this interchange actually can increase the chance of corruption and fall. After this, their ruinous fall and war, the surviving Atlanteans may just have decided that the hidden city will better serve their purpose. They may have chosen to so-called disappear. It's not because they have all died out. And in this community of light, a Shambhala, so to speak, they may just continue advancing for the last 10,000 years or so and just wait patiently till the world is ready for their return. And I think what we're arguing here, yes, I am taking a leap from the writings of Sri Aurobindo, but if you follow the chain of logic, I think it's not something out of the realms of possibility. In fact, I am quite convinced that it is very possible. And on top of that, the very interesting thing is that with the supramental descent, it has brought about a lot of interesting possibilities. Here, I'm running out of time, so I'll just go through very, very briefly these possibilities. So if Atlantis still exists, and let's just say it will reappear at some point, right? Especially at the point when mental subjectivism has taken off, then there is two or three, then one possibility is in fact they will come immediately into conflict with the rest of the world because they are quite different and they're so scary and that kind of thing. Or perhaps they could live in harmony with the rest of the world. Yeah. And the point about the supermind is that the supermind is a force. I'm just reading from here. This is in a different context, I must qualify. It's talking about the Gnostic community that will be established by the supermind. But it is to be supposed that the new and completed light of the supermind will bring also a new and completed power. It might not be necessary for it to be entirely separate. It might establish itself in so many islets and from there spread through the old life, throwing up upon it its own influences and filtrations, gaining upon it, bringing to it help and illumination, which a new aspiration in mankind might after a time begin to understand and welcome. It is actually possible that perhaps the supramental consciousness can make possible that if Atlantis were to suddenly appear again, it might make possible a much greater chance of harmony between the rest of the countries and itself. And it's also possible for it to be no longer like hidden and isolated. That's just something for us to think about. Yeah, so this part further establish it. As I say, the slides will be made available. So the radical speculation, so to speak, I'm making here could be considered in greater detail through the work of Sri Aurobindo and all that. And the last part, which I will not go through, is how this curve is likely to look at. Very briefly, and Sri Aurobindo. So again, for this last part, we are again returning very closely to the writings of Sri Aurobindo. We are no longer talking about Atlanteans who may emerge out of a cave. We are talking again about how the age of mental subjectivism will look like. And here, I think Sri Aurobindo and the mother makes very clear and precise predictions again. I think one thing about their writing is that what they predict is testable. It's like almost they say, it is here. I mean, you feel free to compare it with the rest of the world and how the world is progressing. And that's the extraordinary thing. They are not making anything vague. And these are some of the things they predict, which is a new science and technology in this new, what we may call the Atlantean curve or the mental subjectivist curve, okay, where we mastered hundreds of forces, inner forces and elements. If we think our science and technology is great, then can we imagine this new science and technology and what it can do in the right hands, of course, and guided by the right wisdom. And that, by the way, is something that old Atlantis and new Atlantis, whatever it might be, can contribute because they are a culture that live with such power for much longer than us, successfully. This I'll skip totally because I don't have time, but this is really about something that is mentioned by certain traditions about what the Atlanteans have, what they call the Atlantean Stones, and how it might be relevant. And also we may see an increasing fusion of science and spirituality. There's something that the mother said, a very striking quote. The mother has stated that occult knowledge without spiritual discipline is a dangerous instrument. I mean, look what happened to Atlantis, right? The old one. For the one who uses it, as for others, if it falls into impure hands. But spiritual knowledge without occult science lacks precision and certainty in its objective results. It is all-powerful only in the subjective world. The two, when combined in inner or outer action, are irresistible and are fit instruments for the manifestations of the supramental power. The two, when combined in inner or outer action, are irresistible and are fit instruments for the manifestation of the supramental power. To me, the two countries that come to mind is India and Atlantis. It's like coming together kind of thing, occult and spiritual force. So this I'm going to skip. And the last thing is about the significance of mental subjectivism and the recovery of occultism is that Sri Aurobindo wrote in no uncertain terms, and the mother two in parts of the agenda quoted here, that there needs to be a new supramental material substance that's needed for the manifestation of the supramental body. A new physical substance is needed, and a new process of direct manifestation is needed. And it seems very, very plausible that the mental subjectivist communities, Atlantis or otherwise, will be the ones who will be pioneering something like this. Again, why the mental subjectivist step is absolutely crucial before humankind can attain the spiritual age that Sri Aurobindo spoke of right at the beginning. Okay, this is just saying how Atlantean civilization might possess certain technologies that it may be tied to this particular manifestation. And so we do my own feel and my own intuition and logic and my study of Sri Aurobindo's writing is that I will make this somewhat radical notion that the mental subjectivist age will carry with us a reborn Atlantis, actually. It might actually be the old Atlantis coming out again, or it might be we are rebuilding in such a way that a lot of the Atlantean culture and artifacts and even the actual people who has lived there come back. And this recovery will lead to a new and glorious synthesis, the likes of which we cannot even imagine right now. My own feel is that there is a real, Atlantis still exists, and that makes it even more interesting on how the whole thing is going to all harmonize together. But what we can definitely look forward to is unprecedented bending of the curve. So despite the shadows and darkness and all the things we see around us, something quite incredible is right on the horizon waiting to rise. So I think we will just end on this spot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared. It was marvelous, actually. What it reminds me is about the pre-Chaldean, pre-Vedic tradition, which split once, about which Sri Aurobindo and others speak quite extensively in many different places. And that split was defining actually the movement towards occultism in the West, and we have in Egypt and Chaldean or the Semitic traditions which developed the approach to nature through powers, specific occult powers, which became later alchemists and then scientists, and finally we come to the industrial age and the whole development of science. But basically they are built on that ground of the approach of Atlantis, actually, of the knowledge which is deeper than just the surface knowledge of phenomena, goes deeper into the very vital and mental, so to say, structures of the powers of nature. They are hidden to the surface look, but to the outer eye, but they are there. And so knowing about them was the whole Western civilization, which became very efficient with matter. And the other Vedic tradition was kind of developing towards the spirit more and more, neglecting nature. And that's what led India to Advaitic approach and Maya concepts of illusion of outer being, because they had to keep up with connecting to the spirit. Now these two elements have to come back together. And that is quite interesting, because your conclusions were about this, how these two powers would come together, power and knowledge, consciousness and power. They have to again join, and that would be the supramental kind of support for the supramental manifestation. Thank you. It was very, very enlightening and interesting. Your thoughts, especially about Shambhala, and because there were several people. There was Rurik, who was searching for Shambhala for 5 years. So, walking in the Himalayas with his expedition, and he found something, but he never could speak about it. When he was asked about did he find Shambhala, he didn't want to answer. So most probably he did, otherwise he would say no. He was a very honest person. And his pictures are very famous, whatever the art he created. Yes, it's in the New York exhibitions were exhibited, and they are still in New York somewhere. So about the Himalayas, very beautiful pictures. So it's quite interesting. It was this kind of thinking about finding our origins of the technological origin, scientific origin of humanity. Yes, it would be interesting to explore. So it's just my reflection on what you said. Beautiful. So there are several questions here. If you want to address them, shall I read them to you, or you would like to?
You can choose, right?
Okay.
How does it work? Oh.
Okay, they're asking more how you integrate Christianity and Sri Aurobindo's yoga. I think these are first questions before you were even engaged in your topic. May I leave them till the end? It would be interesting to hear for me also. I was always curious how you do that. Okay, they're closer to our conclusion. Can you comment about the Atlantean Stones? Because you skipped that part.
Yeah, I mean, I skipped that part partly because of time, partly because Sri Aurobindo and the mother, I always have to qualify right at the beginning, does not speak about the Atlantean stones. So whatever I'm going to talk about now is taken from other traditions and whatever I may have discovered and whatever it is. So this is the first qualification. None of this is directly from Sri Aurobindo and the mother, although no doubt, as what Vladimir has said before, everything is in the writings, especially in Savitri. Yeah. So the Atlantean stones represents, so to speak, the highest achievement of the Atlantean culture, in a sense, or art. The idea is that they use these material artifacts to incarnate subtle forces, chosen subtle forces, which is very, very interesting, because if you can incarnate these subtle forces, it makes these subtle forces far more accessible. For instance, if we are to try to bring out some higher mental force, as the Sri Aurobindo writes, right, that's far, far above our normal intellect. To do that will take a huge amount of tapasya and all those things, even with the right mantra and all that, it will be very, very difficult. But if the higher mental force, let's just say, is really vibrating in this physical vessel right in front of you, it is a very different matter to invoke it. So according to certain sources, it seems like the Atlanteans have a very complete wheel of such stones. I use the word wheel deliberately from the Tantra. That means you can see the hierarchy of creation as a ladder, right? But what if you take this ladder and flatten it into a wheel? And this wheel is spread out like that. And all these stones capture and incarnate these subtle forces in this way. So in other words, one reason why the Atlanteans managed to push occult knowledge to the extreme, as Sri Aurobindo puts it, is actually they are able to access these subtle forces far more easily than us. There's nothing mysterious why they can do that if they have something like this. All the subtle forces which we have to sweat and do tapasya, and even then may just go mad and never reach, it is right within their grasp because of the Atlantean stones. So needless to say, that is the foundation technology for everything else they do. So what is the significance of Atlantean stones in the supramental age is that this is the art of incarnation. And needless to say, the supramental creation, the supramental body is the ultimate art of incarnation. It seems as if the Atlanteans already have the prerequisite knowledge to do a very great extent what this materialization of supramental body is required. So to put it bluntly, they may be the one culture that can materialize this new substance much better, much more easily than almost anyone else. But of course, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, all that I said so far, while drawing on some elements of Sri Aurobindo, and the Sri Aurobindo mother never, ever talks about the Atlantean stones. Why? Is it because they don't exist? Perhaps. But perhaps it's also because it's not meant to be known, not at that point anyway. I mean, the focus of Sri Aurobindo and the mother at that point was spirituality, transformation, bringing down the supermind. Talk about things like that, honestly, we just detract from the purpose. But I think the time is approaching when talk of such things will be much more productive. So maybe that's my answer, I guess.
Yeah, there is one more question. So after mental subjectivism, there is psychic subjectivism, which is higher, isn't it so?
Well, I think if I understand Sri Aurobindo correctly, he includes the psychic as part of the subliminal. So in other words, in the age of mental subjectivism, we need to discover the psychic being together with the inner mind. That is not the full thing yet, yeah, but I think the psychic, at least in some people, will need to be discovered because it's an integral part of our subliminal being. So I don't think Sri Aurobindo delineate another stage of psychic subjectivism. From mental subjectivism, we will rise into the spiritual age once we recognize the spirit and not the mind as the ultimate reality. That is in chapter 23. You can check it out. Yes. Yeah.
There are two interesting views here because psychic is actually subjective, individual form of consciousness. Yeah? Whereas when we speak about the collective consciousness, it has something to do with what he calls the national soul.
Yeah.
And these nation souls, so to say, they are more of the typal nature. They support the development of the psychic beings and give it full kind of environment in which they can flourish. And there's an occult understanding of these things, which kind of we need to study more, to speak about. But here is another question from the same person. It's quite difficult to imagine an isolated advanced civilization which sprung up very suddenly. Instead, probably Atlantis is an alien civilization. Is it an alien civilization?
Well, I'm quite convinced that Atlanteans are humans, but we have no idea of knowing what preceded Atlantis. Like what Sri Aurobindo has written, I don't want to misquote him. I think it's something along the lines of how not 100,000 of humanity's history is still preserved, or names and so on. That's just a paraphrase. But the fact is, I'm sure there are civilizations even before Atlantis, none as advanced, of course, most likely, but they were preparatory movements. Because Atlantis, the dates are actually quite well known, right? Plato dates Atlantis, the fall of Atlantis, to 9,000 in the Critias in his dialogue, where he mentioned Atlantis. He mentions that it's about 9,000 years before his time. So roughly speaking, it's 11,000 BC where Atlantis fell. Atlantis is not that long ago by the context of human history, in terms of we have been around Homo sapiens for about 100,000 to 200,000 years. So Atlantis is should we say, relatively recent development, which is, by the way, another reason why I don't think they died out. Yeah.
Okay, so, right. What about the Ice Age, which took place in between? Maybe that was also the case why we were thrown back into the Stone Age to start from the beginning, as it were. So that's why we do not have any trace of any civilization before 6,000 BC from the Babylonian starting onwards. We have caves here and there, but caves do not really show us kind of civilized world. What do you think about this? There is another book of Tilak of the Arctic home of Aryans in the Veda.
Oh no, the Arctic home. Oh, to address your earlier thing, but just some things. Actually, the one very interesting thing about Plato's date is that 11,000, 12,000 BC is around the time of what we call the Younger Dryas period, which is the period of great climatic upheaval. Actually, there is no ice age between 12,000 to our time. We are in what they call the Holocene era, which is quite a stable climatic era. But Plato managed to date the fall of Atlantis to a period of great climatic upheaval where the temperature can change up to 10 degrees. 10 is a lot. We are worried about global warming. I say, 5 degrees will kill us all. Can you imagine climate changing by 10 degrees? And it was a terrible time for humanity. We do not even know what actually happened in that 1,000 years period. But that was very strangely the time in which Plato did the fall of Atlantis. Coincidence? I don't think so. The other thing is that actually there are much more advanced things found. There was this temple, huge temple complex in Turkey called, I can't pronounce it correctly, it's called Pelki Tepe or something, which dates again very interestingly to about 11,000 to 12,000 BC. It was a gigantic temple complex that was built generation after generation for thousands of years. It has been in use. And we're not talking about pseudo-scientific archaeology here. This is very, very well established. All of us can Google it. So the oldest evidence of agriculture, public works, very weirdly, date to the very era where Plato says Atlantis fell. And that to me is, that is very, very interesting. Now, whether the Atlanteans withdrew and decided to plunge the rest of the world into the Paleolithic Stone Age, or we don't know, but there is something very, very interesting happening around that. There was a great transition period about 12,000 years ago. And we are going to live through one right now, actually. So let's all look forward to the fireworks. Okay, the good fireworks. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
What about Lemurians? We're coming before Atlantis. Do we know anything about them?
So this question was asked in the last one. My own speculation, completely unsupported by anything Sri Aurobindo wrote, except for that one poem I mentioned, is that the Lemurians might perhaps represent a stage of vital subjectivism. There's some traditions about how the Lemurians are the masters of prana or life force. If that is true, then it makes a kind of sense, right? That you first have a vital subjectivist civilization that rose and fell. Then you have Atlantis, which represents the mental subjectivist civilization that rose and fell. Yeah, it has a second kind of symmetry, but honestly, I have never studied Lemurian in any detail. For whatever reason, it never interested me. So I do not know, but it's just a speculation.
Do you think that Ramayana has something to say about it? Like Ravana on one side, yes, and rising of the mental being, as Sri Aurobindo says, in Rama's avatar, coming down here and establishing the mentality within humanity. Maybe
I definitely think.
No?
Sorry.
Oh, I mean, mythologically, it could be the events of this kind. I have no idea.
I definitely feel intuitively and otherwise, especially for my own study of the Rig Veda, which is one of the reasons why it interests me so much, is there is definitely a deep connection between Atlantis and India. Exactly what kind of connection is obviously completely lost in the midst of time. It may even be that the Vedic path as we know it is shared by the Atlanteans to a great degree. We do not know, but the point, I mean, we are not sure, but the fact is that it's definitely a very close link between these two civilizations. India might perhaps preserve a good amount of the knowledge that Atlantis used to have into our present era, in whatever measure. For instance, some people think that the Vimanas, that's mentioned in Ramayana and other texts, right? The flying palaces, were actually first used by the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans have flying crafts long before anyone else, and they use it in their final war in a great degree. The astras and those terrible weapons and so on and so forth were sort of a preservation of a kind of knowledge. I mean, of course, these are just speculation, but I have very little doubt intuitively that there is a link between the two nations. And if Atlantis were to resurface one day, this ancient alliance or link will be renewed in some fashion. Like what you say, the link between power and knowledge and things like that. But these are things that are merely speculative, right? Which is why I did not include them in any fashion because in the slides, I think we want to focus very, very closely on what Sri Aurobindo has written, given the context of this talk. But these are my own thinking. The Vimanas does interest me. They are very cool and they are very interesting. And there are some people linking that to Atlantis and all that.
Yeah, I agree. And astras, these Brahmastras, which can destroy the whole world, they are all occult powers, occult missiles. They are not real physical missiles. He concentrates his consciousness and he can create the missile which can destroy people. Right. There are a few more questions here. There is a long question, I do not know, from Varsha Patel. My question is not directly related to your presentation, but I would like to hear your point of view. I was wondering if you see a class revolution of some sort happening in the near future. Revolution. It's about revolution of some kind of upheaval. I ask because one paragraph in War and Self-Determination particularly catches my eye. In it, Sri Aurobindo mentions the transition from the power of sovereign kings to commercialism, and must in turn yield to rule of a quote, proletariat. That's what we have here in China, by the way, founded upon work and association. This change, like the other, cannot be accomplished without much strife and upheaval, and there is every sign that its course will be attended with shattering violence of revolution. I think it will happened already in the 20th century, those revolutions. It belongs to that age, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do not know exactly which passage, and I have not reread the idea of human unity or the war and self-determination for a long time. The last time I read that was more than 8 years ago, so I don't want to comment on passages that I may not fully remember. But from what I remember, the little I remember, is that he talks about why a socialist world state will fail, and how he in fact predicts why a European Union will be a big mistake in the sense of how using the systems and mechanisms to unite different nations, especially who are so dynamic as the European nations, is not going to succeed. We need to turn it around, start from the psychological unity first. I think I remember that very distinctly. But as for revolutions, well, the point is that he does not expect a socialist world state or a socialist utopia to succeed. Yeah, but upheaval there will be, I'm pretty sure. In fact, I wrote that in the part one. The reasons for this upheaval is that much of the world, there's still a lot of resistance to the world, in the world, to the divine, to the descending divine truth, to the transformation of the world. And necessarily, it will lead to certain upheavals before humankind can be made more ready for the incoming light. So what I predicted in part one was that we will reach a sort of the decadence of the information age where we have a lot more technology, AI, and so on and so forth, but you have greater and greater inequality, which might actually lead to a kind of revolution or breakdown of the economic structures even. I mean, inequality can only go so far before people start rising up, right? So there are all sorts of such possibilities. But having said that, all these are things which I think are temporary. And there are new elements being thrown into play. Who knows, Atlantis may rise again, certain communities may attain mental subjectivism. That will completely upset the whole international and national order of things, and it's completely unpredictable. I mean, if Atlantis were to appear, let's just say next month, out of the ocean, a shining beacon of light, how is the rest of the world going to react? It is like quite inconceivable, right? It's like the Wakanda, like Black Panther, those kind of movies. It's something incalculable.
Yeah. Do you think that many of our technologies, such as what we have, internet, and also the screen, liquid crystal screens, and so on, they're somehow coming from that source? I was always wondering, where is all this coming from? Some of our best technologies, most advanced technologies, from that hidden source.
Yeah. my own view is that it is that the Atlanteans were the first scientists, most likely. I think Blavatsky or someone, I mean, I never studied her books much, but I think she briefly mentioned it before, that the American engineer is a reincarnation of the Atlantean wizards or something of that sort. So it is quite clear from even Sri Aurobindo's description that the Atlanteans seems to be the first scientists. So the scientists of today are either you may call them reincarnations, or they are incarnating the same energies that move the Atlantean impulse. Of course, they are not able to carry it to the same extent. You can say that the Atlantean impulse in the hands of today's scientists are sort of imprisoned. They are caged. The reason they are caged is because for now, we are only focusing on physical verifications, physical laws, physical data, physical technology. But this is temporary. Sri Aurobindo predicts that this cage will be shattered. And when the cage is shattered, the true science, the real scientific impulse will have its full potential. And so you're right, I perfectly agree. It does come from the Atlantean source. I don't mean necessarily that's inspired by Atlanteans, but it came from the same source, the same part or aspect of divine truth, so to speak. I'm very sure of that, in fact, that the scientists of today are in fact having the same vibrations to a very great extent as the Atlanteans of old, and they may be making the same mistakes as well. Yeah, like look at nuclear weapons, right? Maybe those group of scientists, the Manhattan Project that built the nuclear weapons, who knows, maybe they may be the exact same people who built some terrifying weapon long, long ago that destroyed their civilization. They may be just doing it again. We do not know these such things.
Interesting. Thank you. So, and the last question for today would be about integration of Christianity in Sri Aurobindo, how and why you do this. So,
I do this. It's not a choice. It's something. I mean, all I can say is a compulsion of one's being. I've always been attracted to Christ and Jesus, and I've read the Bible, and not just read the Bible, but felt the presence through the Bible. So there was no doubt to me that the Bible is the word of God. But the kind of Christianity that's been presented to me for the longest time were the kind of Christianity I cannot accept. And so for many years, in my teenage years, I was exploring, and when I came to Sri Aurobindo, again, by a compulsion of being, I have to accept yes, that his teachings really resonate. It's the same reason why am I interested in Atlantis. I mean, these kind of things must come from within, right? So when both the gospel and Sri Aurobindo both resonate deeply with me, then the integration is a matter of necessity. I think it can only succeed if it's a true matter of necessity, not a matter of mere intellectual convenience or intellectual interest. I mean, if it's merely intellectual, then honestly, just playing with words and ideas, and it can easily be done. You can create a new Christo Sri Aurobindo thingy with some monstrosity or something of that sort. But in this case, it was because there's this inner compulsion, should we say, inner drive towards Christ and inner drive towards Sri Aurobindo and the Mother that exists at the same time. So because of that, there is no way but integration must be made. And I think that it has been made clear after so many years that the only way in which they can be fully reconciled is in the supermarket. I mean, not put it that way. In direct experience, in a global consciousness, the only way is that we must reach a kind of experience or kind of consciousness that can reconcile that. That's the only real way. In Savitri, we put it, because Savitri is actually that consciousness we are looking. In Savitri, in that consciousness, we can reconcile. I mean, I can talk about how they are linked, but really that is the real solution. We know Christ is divine love, Christ is associated with the psychic being. And I consider myself a disciple of Christ and a Christian. At the same time, I'm following Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and definitely I give myself to the Mother and to Savitri and all. It is a combined self-giving that I am doing. And I think the only solution to that very weird integration, and many of you surely agree, is that it must break through to that global consciousness that can integrate the two. No other way can do it. I tried every single way. No other intellectual synthesis, ethical synthesis, religious synthesis can succeed. So when my Christian friends ask me about Sri Aurobindo, yeah, but it's not, they won't be able to, I don't think they can understand exactly where I'm coming from, because it's something okay, now maybe I should not patronize by saying that, but because I think Christianity is moving in the direction of experiential spirituality as well, actually, and that's actually one ground of reconciliation. So maybe I just stop here. So that is where I try to reconcile through experience and breakthrough.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jared. It was a wonderful session, a wonderful webinar, many thought-provoking ideas, views on our past and our future and how they are related and connected on the developmental scale in time and space. We are very happy to meet with you again and to continue our dialogue. We could explore deeper these ideas and see where they will lead us in our understanding. So with this, we will conclude our session for today. Thank you again. And
Thank you very much.
Yeah, tomorrow, just a small announcement. Radhe, would you like to make it tomorrow's announcement?
Sure. Many of you probably joined our webinar a couple weeks ago when we had Dr. Sumitra Basu speak about the descent into the and ascent from the subconscious and inconscient realms. And he had a tremendous amount of information, and we had lots of unanswered questions. So he's very generously agreed for tomorrow, January 31st, and then next Sunday, February 7th, to do a 90-minute review session starting at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And tomorrow he's going to focus on the first part of his talk, which is involution, and he'll add a new topic, avatar, that he didn't get to. And then next Sunday, he'll talk about the evolutionary process. So it's both a review and time for you to ask many questions and answers. So we'll be hosting it as a meeting instead of a webinar. So you will all get to see each other, be able to open your mic and ask questions, and it'll be very interactive. If you haven't signed up, I'll be sending out one more email this afternoon. And please register and join us tomorrow. And thank you, Jared, very, very much. It was very enlightening. Appreciate your ideas and thoughts.
Thank you. So goodbye. All the best. Bye.
Namaste.
All the best.